Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Colorist Appreciation Day event with our host, Xīn Jīn Mèng. Xīn Jīn Mèng is a professional content creator who has worked in various roles for books, magazines, slideshows, board games, card games, video games, online presentations, and the proverbial more. Welcome. Would you like to get us started?
Yes, hello. Once again, yes, I am Xīn Jīn Mèng, and I've been asked to appreciate color. Isn't it great? So we're going to go ahead and talk a lot today about the technology that drives color, some of the techniques that people use to work with it. We'll go ahead and take some questions. So if you've got a question and need to stop me, go right ahead. We'll have some Q&A at the end. But I probably will go pretty fast. I've got a lot of slides here, and I've got a lot to talk about. So color, they put it in comics. So we're going to talk a little bit about how they started doing color, and I want to have some tips at the end here about how you can get around many problems of color or some issues, just a couple things. And also, I apologize. Most of the examples I'll be showing today are from the US direct market. I'll try to sneak in some European or other comics. Sorry, no Tony Wong today. Sorry, Tony. But, just because I left your favorite title out doesn't mean we didn't like it. So, yes, people love printing. They especially love printing stuff. And early on, they were trying to figure out ways to make stuff look pretty and have fancy color to it. And so there are a lot of theories behind this. And you've probably heard about, red, yellow, and blue in primary school, where they're telling you how to mix those colors together and make stuff. So they were doing that for about a couple hundred years. It makes some of these like vintage books have a really nice color look to it. And if you've seen some of the older scan stuff, like the comic strip itself, we're not going to get too much into the history, but they would sell individual prints of comics or broadsheets. And so a lot of times they were using a process like aquatint or mezzotint or intaglio, where they would basically rub knives or little rollers over plates to make dot patterns, because they would only have one red or one blue ink. And so if they wanted to make different levels of it, they would carve these little dots in it. We'll get back to this a little bit later because you probably know this process by a different name. And of course, they had so many of the problems you still see today, like this poor 1887 print where the red sheet was off a little bit. This was a common problem called a registration error or an offset problem. And it's going to change the way people draw comic books here in a little bit. So naturally people were looking for a better way to do this. And so for about 100 years, dominating was the four color process. In fact, today they often refer to comics from the golden age of the 30s to the 80s as the four color printing process, where they invented something called the Ben-Day process and could do tiny little dots. And by varying the frequency and size of these dots, they could make different patterns. And that let them settle into this palette here that dominated the industry for many, many years. Now, this has a lot of problems with it. First of all, there's something called gain that you can see here in the middle column here in the bottom, where not all of the dots will spread evenly. The more ink you put on the page, the more they start to seep together and bleed together and make very weird shapes. You can also see we've got more registration errors up there at the top. There's no way to keep these plates from getting slightly offset from each other. They'll always be off by like an eighth of an inch or a 16th of an inch. Getting it to align better cost a lot more money. So to compensate for that, they started to do a lot more heavy black outlines. So for many of the early years, you would have very cheap paper with ink that is bleeding all over the place. So you would have one illustrator would go ahead and do the black plate by putting a lot of black ink there, often very thick to compensate for the fact that the plates would slide. And then somebody else had to go through and manually assign those colors. They had to go ahead and knock out stuff in the plates or carve holes. They would sometimes get a penciled color guide that would say, okay, this one is, RYB 112 and RYB 121. And we wouldn't know what it looked like until they actually printed it. And so because they had to do these very quickly, there's my favorite quote, they didn't want it good, they wanted it Wednesday. They often relied on just big areas of flat color. So that's where you get the flat look or super flat look. And a lot of comics, some of them look like a little weird. Sometimes you get artists who specialized in very expressive lines. Like on the right here, we have Basil Wolverton, who he can control all the black ink and do all the pencils. So his inks are very, very thick and dominate it. And color is kind of an afterthought. You can see that the backgrounds there are usually just one or two large colors splashed on top of each other. And of course, they wouldn't know what this looked like until they printed it, because like I said, they're just writing this down. So that one on the left, I don't know what happened. They're missing their blue plate. I think they swapped their yellow with their blue and didn't have one. The one on the right, those beaks and the blonde hair are supposed to be like yellow or red. Something happened there where when they printed it, they just screwed up the plates. There was no way to know. Now, that's not to say you couldn't get very impressive results with this. Like Winsor McCay, mostly famous for the Nemo stuff, but I went with a Hal Foster here, where if you have one or two people controlling the whole process and they know what they're going to do, then they can specify special effects. Here's Hal doing the background where the illustration's mostly on the cyan plate. So he's get this rich blue, and he went ahead and knocked out this nice rich rainbow here. So you could still get a lot of impressive art. And this was in newspapers. This is on the cheapest paper possible to get out to folks. But notice the clouds mostly do a sort of a gray scratch or hatching tone there. This took a lot of effort to get done, but you could still do some pretty impressive effects. This was totally, if you were a digital artist, you probably wouldn't do it this way. So the four color process dominates for many years. And in the US, for a confluence of things, we wind up getting superheroes dominating. And the color production gets a little bit better over time, but what happens is colors are used for a lot of dynamic outfits, especially superhero outfits. Superman, for example, is in all primary colors and repeated, whereas characters like the Joker or Lex Luthor are in secondaries. And these colors are repeated in these big, bold, garish outfits so much that they form their own special vocabulary. Batman is the Dark Knight. And uh, well, the Flash. Do we have a Flash? Yeah, we do. The Flash has a distinctive red color that they use. And so this idea of heroes in primaries and villains in secondaries develops its own kind of vocabulary that repeats through a lot of comics of this era. Broad strokes, but still important. Now, of course, over in the European market, they're telling a lot more fantasy stories. I mean, kind of the same things, that kind of stuff. Um, Once again, they have a much bigger market with a bande dessinée or whatever sort of adventure stories, but they're still limited by a lot of the same factors. They still have the four color process and are still limited by that. So there's a lot of emphasis on pencils and ink work, with color usually as a flat afterthought. This is one of my favorite, Philip Droulet. As you can see here, most of his heavy lifting is done on the black plate. I think this is digitized. I know this was printed on a higher end paper, so they had maybe a little extra red in there, but you can see once again, the spotted darks are doing the heavy lifting with color as an accent. And since he wanted an otherworldly feel, he said, well, I'm doing a comic. It doesn't have to look realistic. Let's go crazy. This is Richard Corbin, who is famous adult artist. Now, Richard Corbin used a lot of airbrush work, and he had the ability to put in his head what the stuff would look like after it was printed. He could color directly on the plates. And so he was able to get many of these fantastic colors in some of these higher end four color processes because he would draw on the individual plates and then composite it together. And that gives a lot of his early work this very bright, psychedelic look to it. That is very imaginative. And they've started reprinting a lot of the old Den materials so you can get them. They do screw adult. So, and, they've got some weird ideas, but they look amazing. Like if you want to see some ideas of some crazy stuff you can do with the color. Now, this is Weapon X from the 1980s. This is the last gasp before color, because pretty soon we're going to move into some better color processes. But Barry Windsor Smith also was drawing on the individual color plates. And so this specific comic book issue, it's not that other people weren't using these techniques. It's just, it was rare that you saw a mainstream title combine all of these so aggressively. Like you can see how our character has a pink, a white, and a gray tone to make him look dimensional and flat. You can see this is way different from that flat color we were showing off before. This is holistically engineered to have colors being manipulated in every plane at the same time. And so, in the 80s, this really impressed people. This blew people away. I'm not sure how much it resonates today, but once again, nice things to see what people were trying to do to get around this kind of stuff. And of course, we can't forget newspaper comics. Like everybody, I think it probably has heard of Calvin and Hobbes, which is a very popular comic strip. This is I picked this comic strip out because this is unusual. I mentioned color as vocabulary. Calvin has blonde hair and a red shirt. So his yellow and red and blue shorts are primary colors and pop out. So when Watterson did this street scene, he deliberately chose an autumn palette of browns and cool grays to build the city. A lot of other artists might have like dipped into the cyan or the magenta for this. And the reason why he did that is because that draws your eyes to the lower left where the only blue is in the car and there's Calvin as the only yellow and red. So even though the scene is incredibly busy, Watterson has used color here to let everybody know that's where Calvin is. And then they didn't compromise on the details of the picture. It still looks very busy and complex. This is an example of how you can use color, to help improve the entire design. And not just, as an afterthought. So yeah, and once again, here we are. You can see here in the upper left that once again, even though it's an outdoor scene, there's lots of them. Your eyes are immediately drawn to Calvin because he's the only red in the entire thing. As a contrast to this, you can also use the absence of color. We'll talk a little bit about how neutrals like whites and blacks and grays are still color. In the lower right, we've got Heavenly Nostrils, the unicorn here, is the only dominant white shape. So they're very careful that in this comic strip, they're always putting a solid fill behind them. And then because they're the only big giant white area, your eyes are drawn to that, and that makes them pop out. So this is like, zero as a color. And once again, tonight, nice to think about that. You can use color as an accent to draw people's eyes. Now, when we get back to the Lynn Clair, so Lynn Clair is a style that dominates a lot of French or Belgian comics, which is where you're only using very thin lines. You can have detail, you can have hatching, but for the most part, thin lines, no spotted shadows or darks, and usually flat color or gradient color, as you see here. And like Hergé with the Tintin style was very famous. This, of course, is Mobius, who is very highly praised. This kind of style requires a lot of heavy lifting from the line work. Like Mobius here is doing a lot of 3D, where he's using 2 or 3 point perspective to make the shapes. And so the colors are otherworldly or fantastic on top of that. GF Darrow assisted on this one. Yeah, I want to go back to this one. So, like, especially with this here, in order to make this bird look like it's huge and closer to the camera, he's deliberately left color or put a unique color on the beak out of it. And then the big flat blue behind it makes everything else look kind of remote. And then that line work is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Like I know that he must have gone down and drawn the perspective lines and done all of this to get this to come out like this. This is, high end type stuff, but that's why Mobius was so. And Mobius stuck to this kind of technique to use thin lines and make them do the heavy lifting, even to late career. This is the Halo comic that he did, which does have the varying line weight, but once again, still doing the flat color or simple gradients, with the line work doing a lot of the heavy lifting. So the color here then takes on otherworldly quality to help expert. You can see they're still doing shadows and that kind of stuff. So yeah, here I'm appreciating color, talking about the absence of color. So that was much the early or mid period of the 20th century. Around the 1980s, we started to see a big shift in the comic book landscape. It used to be that you would see comic books everywhere. They would be in corner stores. There would be newsstands where you could pick them up. Some of you may remember these magazines you used to buy. They had comics in them, or the spinner rack, Hey Kids Comics, that famous stuff. And around the late 80s, early 90s, you saw a shift to the direct market. This is where comic books were sold in specialty comic book stores, and then later as graphic novel anthologies in bookstores, or direct to you through Comixology or e-readers, or perhaps downloaded directly from websites, direct to the consumer, eliminating that need for news racks, which meant a big change. It meant we didn't need to print on cheap paper anymore and try to lower the overhead, we could raise the price. The Teen Titans on the left was from 1980. The next one is from 1984. So in 5 years, the cover price almost quadrupled. And that's because they raised the production quality. They started using better paper. They started using better printing and better coloring. And with the rise of the direct market, we're then going to see that funnels into, in the 90s, a bunch of improvements we're going to see in comics. And now something else I want to make sure that we talk about, of course, is ink limitations. I mentioned the paper is cheap, and you'll still run into this today. We'll talk about this briefly, but basically the cheaper your paper, the less ink it can hold. I already mentioned that when you print something, you've got to put ink in the paper and then it's got to hold it. So obviously newsprint can only hold so much ink. This meant that you couldn't have a lot of this stuff like your rich black that's mentioned here in the second column. Like if your paper can only hold so much ink before it bleeds through, like you can see in the lower right here, we can see ink bleeding through cheap paper, or the paper just won't hold it. It just can't absorb it. And that keeps you from having your more extreme colors, your richer reds, your deeper blacks, your wonderful oranges and greens. Those just, the paper can't do it. Either it can't hold the ink or it would fall apart. So with the direct market, we started to see more expensive paper or prestige formats where the covers are in cardboard and the paper goes up from 60 pound. And then we have more colors. We can have sort of these browns or richer reds. This was Hellboy was an early entry here. This work right here with Matt Wagner's painted work, he's doing a lot of subtle transitions or a lot of subtle spatter with the brush. Like in the lower right here, you can see that there's that gray tone. They're trying to make it look like a street scene, or that soft pink. If he wasn't printing on higher end paper, this stuff, these colors couldn't be this bright or this garish. We just saw back then with Barry Windsor Smith the best he could do with Wolverine's face there, naked. Whereas in the lower left here, you can see that the pink and white transitions, even though these are pretty much the same colors, they look a lot more dark and contrasting. And Wagner has a bigger palette to work with. Also, because of the direct market, you started seeing more collectible type stuff. These are from trading cards that they passed out. Once again, we're seeing superheroes again in their dynamic outfits, Spider-Man or Iron Man, they're red, but we can do more details. You can, these kinds of like rock textures, wouldn't show up on the earlier paper. Either they couldn't hold those colors or it would bleed. I have a fondness for the work of Kevin O'Neill. This is some of the painted work he did. Once again, this would be on 80-pound paper and either glossy reproduced or photo reproduced. So if you zoom in, we can't here, but if you had a copy of this, you could zoom in and see the brush work, like the way it's done with watercolors or with markers, and those textures bleed through. Those wouldn't show up unless you had better paper. So also, with the rise of the direct market, we saw a bit more experimentation from the big guys. This is a weird comic called Havoc and Wolverine Meltdown. It's not very good, but I'm including it here because it was a painted comic that got a mainstream release. And they basically photographed paintings and reproduced them in a book. Technically impressive. Also technically impressive, I guess, to compete with that. This was a DC Comics release, World Without End. Very bizarre and unreadable. But once again, had a mainstream release, 5 issues, all painted, all color. I guess this was like a technical flex. I guess this is the Avatar of its day. So if you look in the like late 80s, early 90s, there's a lot of these technological pushes back then. Someone suggests I need to have a shout out to Kabuki. This was an early indie title by David Mack. Very experimental with a lot of painted stuff. I, of course, am a fan of Euro comics. So this is a shout out to Glenn Fabry and, skip later. Some of the 2000 AD, some of the fantasy stuff they did, they went ahead and pushed for like Simon Bisley. This is Glenn Fabry, who I'm a bigger fan of. Some of you have probably heard of Black Sad. That's an import that came in. That's watercolors. They still do it with practical media and still printing it. So once again, only possible for a higher end market. So also during the 80s is the rise of your modern era. These days, I believe most of you are doing your comics on computer these days. Well, so before there were computers, before there was Photoshop, like Photoshop doesn't show up till 1990. So when digital color started, it was a bit of a novelty. When they brought Akira to the US, And this is something else we're going to tragically talk about. They thought, oh, people in the US won't buy a black and white comic book. Never mind, it might be one of the greatest comic books ever. Never mind, it made a movie that has a like signature slide. It's black and white. US people won't buy black and white. It's got to be in color. I'm not paying this much. So they got a studio to make a color mock-up to see what it would be. And, this was fun because they had to get photocopies and then they had to be mailed from Japan because we're going to fax them. You can't send, internet doesn't exist yet. And so they did digital, and I don't know what software they used to colorize this. I looked, this is done by the Ollie Optics Studio, and all they would say is that the software they used in the 80s, they don't use anymore, that people use newer tools. So I don't know what software, I don't know if this is Deluxe Paint or whatever this is, but this is very early examples of color. And as you can see here, they're pretty much sticking to that kind of European flat look, but they're going to have some fancier tools later. So I want to do a quick shout out to, sometimes you'll see this mentioned in history. This is Shatter, sometimes called the first computer comic, but this is misleading. Shatter had its black plate drawn on the Macintosh, mostly with the mouse. I think they shifted to scanners later, but don't hold me to that. I know at least the first issue was drawn entirely by a mouse, and then they colored it by hand and printed it in high-end paper. So even though this looks very impressive, only the black was done on the computer. And they didn't bother, one thing I love about this is they didn't bother to correct. So if they like had to stretch or squatch something, they left the square halftones in and you get these irregular shapes. And I just think that's a really neat look that you only see in this comic, because after this you get corrective tools that automatically correct it. But, they say they like little artifacts. Shatter is also not very good, but it's a fascinating read to see what you could do with this kind of retro look. Shatter was eventually followed up by Crash, which is often called the first computer-generated comic. This comic was done completely on computer, on a Mac 2, and colorized on the computer. And once again, before Photoshop, I'm pretty sure they used Mac Paint or some other tool for this. And you can see a lot of the stuff that would, if some of you are web comic fans, you can see like the early days when they do a lot of copying and pasting or sprite comics, he's already using those techniques where they're repeating stuff. We'll see that again over here. Also, you can see here with the colorizations, this is a different comic. This is, I guess, once Marvel did their Crash, DC decided they had to do one. So they got Pepe Moreno, who worked in video games, to do Batman Digital Justice, which is all digital. And you can see he's doing, once again, the webcomic thing of, hey, those eyes look good. Let's just copy and repeat them. Or that I just drew that one face. Let's just keep copying and pasting that face over and over again. There's no rule against it, right? We're saving work. You can also see they had a weird attitude for color here. Like they know that you're supposed to do a black plate and then you're supposed to do colors on top of it. And I guess they're doing a color on a different layer or channel, but they don't quite know how to handle it. So you get this weird kind of like blurry Tron look where everybody is some kind of grayscale that has some kind of ugly color slapped on top of it. So they'll get better, but in 88 and 90, this was what passed for digital color. Now, the Ollie Optics Studio, which did the Akira coloring, became a go-to studio for colorization later. As you can see here, they worked through their shop, and you probably wouldn't even know this was computer colored. Like, if you saw this, you would just think, oh, well, this is just, a later generation comic. It looks just like the painted ones. But this was done totally digitally. Also not a very good comic, but it's a milestone, so that's why I put it here. So the 90s saw a bunch of big shakeups. You had the direct market, you had the speculator boom, and most importantly, you had Image Studios in the US. Image Studios was the three biggest Marvel people, broke off and started their own studio, and they had a mission statement, which is they wanted to make modern comics. And when they wanted to make modern comics, that meant modern computer color. So this stuff here, like the Spawn that you see here on the left, that's digital color. Like that's a flex. That incredibly rich red that would be on both the cover and the interior, those rich greens there that would like mold together like that you didn't see that. Remember, we were just looking at our cheap, I just showed off that Weapon X or whatever, which was the pinnacle of print technology. And here you have these guys who came out of nowhere and their comics, their colors are just jumping right off the page. This is Malibu Studios, who also invested a lot in comics and their color technology. Once again, this is also digital color. The other shops are literally still doing that stuff they were doing in the 30s and 40s of RYB, assigning it with pencils. Here are these guys with their fancy software doing the digital color so they can do those cool transitions, those chrome shades, those blends, that kind of stuff. There's also some secret techniques we'll talk about near the end of this, to get all of this in here. Malibu proves so popular when they start in 93 that by 95, even though Marvel's going out of business and going bankrupt, Marvel Studios buys Malibu just for their color department. And then they cancel all the comic books and all the Malibu people get turned to doing digital color. That's how important digital color was to Marvel. They would totally ruin a comic book. And yeah, here's Generation X on the left, which was an early one that inherited that. So largely forgotten today because it's never good, but it's got color comic. And of course, Danger Girl, once again, I'm pulling a lot of these out because these are examples of the new technology of color being shown off to a lot of stuff. And just a brief note here for the computer comic, I picked this one out. This is one of the Malibu comics. This is called Prime, which is, just kind of a kid gets superpowers. But what's unusual about it is when the Sega CD came out in 94, they took the comic. Not only does the Sega CD include the game based off of the character, it includes issues of the comic book that they put in CD format. And as near as I can tell, they took the originals and then did what's called bit crushing. They had to remove a lot of the detail and color because the Sega could only display like 30 colors at a time or something like that, and redid the captions, and the comics can be read right off of the CD. It's so weird. It's the only time I think I've ever seen that. This might be the first comic that got digital distribution. I mean, maybe there's some others. I wouldn't be surprised, but just, once again, milestone of color. And they did their best to do it. They tried to keep the primary stuff. You can see they're very aggressive there with the dithering. A couple other shout outs to early stuff. This is Noctropolis. Noctropolis is a point and click game, but the people who made it really love 90s comic books. If you like 90s comic books and want a point and click game, you can check this out. It includes an introductory comic. I don't know if they published this separately. Maybe they did. It's just kind of funny, and wow, I love the 90s faces. I love that guy named Desperado, like with his fists out there. Urgh, I'm so 90s. Once again, computer color. And because now this was a computer comic, so they, as near as I can tell, they never intended to print this. So you can see they're very bold with their color transitions on this. It still looks like a comic, and they probably hired comic book people to do it. But the game itself and the colors here are very much informed by this, but not the same. So they're doing like a lot of these deep purples and blues that might not necessarily reproduce in print. So it's interesting to look at. It's a very visually striking game. Not visually striking as Reflux. I just put this in here because it's another digital comic. Not sure what's going on with this, but let's blow past that. Okay, so we still have the direct market. Like I said, like we've gone from the 80s to this 90s level, and this is what print comics will look like for a while in the higher end stuff. Notice they're getting a lot more aggressive with gradients. They don't have to do those stair-step transitions. Once again, the computer does all of it. We're also getting richer colors. Even though this is a 4-color printing process and still pretty light, and the paper is a lot nicer, they found ways to still use the cheaper paper, but make these transitions. This is pretty much the same paper we just saw with some of those 80s comics, but look how they're getting these like rich fireplace hues or beautiful greens and not that kind of uglier stuff we saw before. This is all possible because the people working on the computers have finally figured out how to translate the different channels. They don't have to do those ghost, like weird ghost faces we saw in Digital Justice anymore or Crash. They can take inks. Also at this era, they're using a lot more digital scanners so they can scan in a plate. Oh yeah, somebody just pointed out Beneath the Steel Sky. Yeah, Dave Gibbons, who did Ultraverse. So brief talk here. This is going to be a thing that trips people up a lot. When we talk about they needed to figure out how to get digital to print, there's something called your color model. And the big thing is subtractive versus additive. Paper starts off white. and then you apply ink to it to make it darker. You subtract light from it by adding more ink. But when you're working on a computer, your computer starts off with a black monitor, and then you turn it on and shine light on it. And the more light you shine on it, the brighter and more varied your colors get. So it's additive. You're adding more light. This changes the colors that can be displayed. Here in the middle, we have an example of colors. Notice there's the visible color range, everything a typical human can see. And then we have the weird polygon shapes. Naturally, the old school newsprint is a very smaller range of this that's still inside the color monitor range of 16 million colors. But we've expanded it a little bit, and we've got offset printing, like they say, offset on coded stock. Notice that in the third shape there, the coded stock shape, there are colors that can be in print, but can't show up on a typical color monitor. Likewise, there are colors on a color monitor, like especially those corners, those bright reds, greens, and purples, that you can't print. This is something that's called gamut. And this is the limit of colors you can get. And so you're going to have a problem when you're working digitally is you can't use any of the colors that if you're planning on printing, you can't use any colors that won't show up in print. And there'll be colors in print that you can't look at on your monitor. You can't see them until they show up. And a lot of your digital programs, like I know some of you might be Metabang fans, or I'm a Clip Studio fan, those only work natively in RGB. Even though they have tools that can say, well, we can limit what you see to CMYK, their internal math is RGB, and they still process colors as RGB. They'll still make illegal colors. You either need to learn how to work around those or switch to a program like Photoshop or Krita that can actually handle those. Oh, and Procreate handles those, but you have to go through some hoops. It's weird. Now, a lot of you these days, if you go to print a comic, you're in luck. Back in the 90s, if you wanted to print a digital comic, you had to have the right software to do it. Sometimes they would get a Quark Express file or bound that up and send that off to the printers. Sometimes they would send a tagged image file format file. Sometimes they would print off of JPEGs, but they didn't know what they were doing. These days, back in about the 2000s, people were complaining that there was a format called portable document format, but it didn't have any provisions for CMYK printing. It was only designed for RGB. And so a bunch of people got together and yelled at Adobe, and Adobe, the last good thing Adobe did was they specified PDF/X, which is a 2001 format. And out of all the PDF formats like X, E, or A, or whatever, X is the format that has support for printing. And if any of you have export nowadays, you can go ahead and export to any comic you want to a PDFX, specifying page size, offset, bleeds, trims, everything, and send that off to a print shop, and they'll print it for you. That's the good news. You can use whatever software you want, even different software. Just add it all together, just import it in there, and send it off to the printer. It's a beautiful era to make your own comics, but as a side effect of this, you're gonna have to do your own color correction because nobody's spotting you. Okay, and of course, now with the rise of digital era, I'm sure, is there a name for this? I've been calling this the B&E method. This is where you've got your hands on the B&E keys for brush and eyedropper. And so when you're painting stuff, you would like paint a color with the brush and then switch to eyedropper to sample how it mixed, and then paint with the mixed color, and then use that to build mixed colors on top of each other. I don't know if that technique has a name, but it's a very signature look that shows up in the 2000s because everyone's using Photoshop or programs like Photoshop and can do these kinds of color transitions. And these look beautiful on screen, but of course they're all done with RGB math. So when you try to print these out, they often will turn into mud because you weren't working with CMYK, you were working with RGB. So it's a good look. I just have this here as a contrast. This was 2000 where they painted everything, and this is 2013 where they did everything digitally. You can see that there's a lot of difference in the color choices. Here, the original artist can only work with colors that exist in the physical world and can be photographed. Whereas here, the person, because they're digital, they have a much bigger range. So notice this range here is a little flatter, where you've got dark and light contrasts with each other, and stuff is usually confined to different regions. Whereas this one, the color is a lot more blown out, that they've got a lot more brighter regions to it. Like you couldn't pick a nicer day to get all these guys together to fight. whereas here there's a little more unity. That's possibly because the picture was lit and then photographed, so that would give it some consistency. But you can see here that there was this era, especially in the 2010s, when colors were blown out like this and you had these dark contrasts. And that's because of a lot of RGB math. Likewise, here is our buddy Greg Rutowski, does a lot of Magic the Gathering art. This is one of the few physical paintings he's done. Most of what he does is digital. And once again, you can see here muted colors, darker contrasts, whereas here he can literally paint with light. So you've got this beautiful mist effect and this beautiful light. These are conscious choices you'll have to make when you do color. That's why we just thought we'd just appreciate this today. Oh, just as a side note, we talked about the Ben Day patterns. These days, you very rarely see those, especially if you went from digital PDF to plate. These days, since the printer is making those dots on the fly, like it doesn't have to engrave those plates, you may have heard about adding a noise pattern to your colors to keep like stair steps and stuff from showing up. Well, these days, a lot of the places you print on demand will automatically do stochastic dithering. Ooh, which is they'll basically just fuzzy the dots for you. So all that weird stuff we saw on the Macintosh earlier, they'll print the dots very tiny in the magazine itself to prevent. And that's why when you do print on demand or computer to print today, it looks a lot nicer. Just like those little dots they were carving back in the Middle Ages. Just thought I'd point that out. We're back in the Middle Ages technology. Okay, so some brief notes here on your dealing with your own color process. There's something Conway's law is the theory that the way you do something affects the way it looks. Back when they were doing comics in the 4-color era, you had the penciler, you then inked it, and then colored it. And so that got you a process here where you had somebody like Jack Kirby, his design here, because he's very heavy on the penciling and the writing, he has a very strong design sense where everybody is here. And then they get some inker to do it very quickly. So you get these broad strokes and you get this color. And even though there's some nice ideas going on here and there's some nice perspective and stuff, they just slapped whatever colors they could on each of these ranges. And because the colors are so broad and there are no countertones or shades or anything, this turns into a big mess. So on the one hand, I love this. On the other hand, boy, this looks terrible. Okay, compare that to like if you did this today. Here's a modern version of that kind of comic. Once again, ultra busy, lots and lots of people. But notice that they limited their color choices. They're using color as vocabulary. Batgirl here is in purple. The bad guys are in orange. I think that is Black Canary. She only shows up a couple times. But they made the background a solid blue. We're back to the pink and teal era, like we said here. And by using limited colors, instead of looking like that big horrible mess that we saw earlier, now we can make some of this stuff out. And once again, these are both 2-page spreads, so you would have seen these together. Now we're using color to help inform the shapes. We have fewer colors, but they do more, they do more lifting. Oh, and just a brief note here. It's fascinating though. I just want to mention that manga is a big deal. And manga has its own visual vocabulary where they use, strict tones. This is manga from across 50 years. I have Masamune Shiro's earliest stuff compared with the modern One Punch Man. And notice that all 3 of these look like they all could have come from the same era, despite that, back when I showed you 50 years apart in the US, the styles and writing look very different, whereas these look very unified. Yes, if we read the original comics, you could probably tell bigger differences, but notice they use the same tones, they use the same lines, they use the same visual vocabulary. Just thought I'd point that out. And if I want to do a brief shout out, since we're going about color appreciation, you have the future available to you. So you have computers. So you have the ability to slot in new images or, photograph stuff and do a lot more mixed media. Like a guy like Jack Kirby back in the 60s and 70s, when he tried to do this, he only had newsprint and photos and whatever he could clip out of magazines. So when he tried to do these kinds of weird photo montages, they have a nice, neat psychedelic look to them, but there's only so much he could do. And then here in the 80s, because they had a higher budget for these comics here, they were photographed. So sure, let's put a guy on bubble wrap and have him hassled by plastic insects, or let's go ahead and use Letraset stickers, on our background to try and create a kind of othering fantastic effect. If you dig around for comics like Stray Toasters or Electro Assassin, you can see some of this like neat kind of mixed montage. These days, because you have computers, you can just photo slot in weird or garish stuff or 3D models of that kind of stuff. You start thinking outside the box a little bit. This is one of my favorites is Masamune Shiro. When he got a scanner, he would start doing things like putting like a sponge. Like, what's it happen if you scan a sponge? Well, you get this weird halo effect. And he says, wow. And so he went ahead and copy and pasted that inside the wing here. Or this Orion cover. Hey, what happens when we put gold foil? Or my favorite, the eyeballs at the bottom there, those are glass marbles, like the marbles you would play with. You just scan them and they give this weird specular effect. Is okay, we'll just dump those in there. And I guess some pictures of rocks. And so you get this weird garish color look that, he puts his inks on top of, but he's just using the lasso tool to copy and paste them. And this is something you have access to as a colorist. You could like just have dirty paper or something like that. Just some mixed media. You have the tools. Oh, and this is just a shout out. Fraser Irving is one of those people who does really weird stuff. Like he'll have bizarre bitmap repeating textures or psychedelic stuff. Storming Heaven was a big showcase for him where he just went whole ham with a bunch of weird stuff. But Fraser Irving does some really nice stuff. I recommend it. Also weird colors. Like notice he'll just solid color people blue or pink or whatever. Some of the 2000 AD stuff gets very experimental, like Mark Harrington or Clint Langley here is a bit divisive because I know he's doing photo compositing with a lot of this stuff, but some of it looks pretty wacky. And it's a very unique look that, at least looks different. And sometimes I think it's done for funny comic effect. A little copy pasted, but once again, I think these are kind of neat. Something to look at. And of course, there's no rules. Like a comic like 920 London will just have physical watercolors, digital stuff, photos, scan out, like a whole bunch of stuff to scan on top of each other. These days, because you go digital to press, anything you can get scanned or in the computer, you can print. I do want to make a brief note here about accent color. So we mentioned earlier that color processes used to be expensive where you had to do plates. So like if instead of doing 4-color, which requires 4 plates to all line up, you could do 2-color or 3-color. And that way you don't have to worry that much. Like here's Clifford above me, the big red dog, where he was just red. They just had the 1-color plate. And that way it was less money to produce because you had fewer colors and it was cheaper to do. And so you would sometimes see comics that were only 1 or 2-color processes. These days, you don't see that as much because when I've been getting printing bids for this, the 4-color machine I showed you earlier, they would just dump it in the 4-color machine anyway. You're not saving anything by doing, unless you have extremely specialized box or package printing. This kind of accent color costs just as much to do as black and white. But I have been told by publishers that because black and white doesn't sell as well as color, that some stuff like The Magic Fish or here on the right, Ducks by Kate Beaton, like those comics were originally in black and white and they printed them in color. Like, why? I mean, is off blue somehow better than just black and white? It costs more money to do that. It literally like doubles or triples the production cost just to go from black to blue. But apparently in the US it does. I just thought I mentioned that. From your labor perspective, it's so easy for you to just put a blue filter on top of your grayscale artwork and send it off. It would cost you almost nothing. It would just raise the production cost of the print. But audiences like it. It can also be used for a color vocabulary, like here where they're shifting from blue to pink to let you know they've gone from one setting to another. So this can be an alternative if you don't have enough time or resources to do full color. Okay, we're getting a little close. Yeah, visual literacy for black and white. I love black and white. Okay, we're going to blow through this real fast. Digital recoloring was of course, done for comics these days. So when you buy a digital comic today, like if you buy Crisis of Infinite Earths, the digital version, it'll be the 2024 version and not the terrible 1985 version, which had a bunch of printing problems. Also here, they tried to stay closer to the original coloring intent. So even though like they've got brown volcanoes instead of yellow, they're still trying to stick close to those. There was a controversy in the 2000s where they were trying to make comics look more modern. So you'd have the Mobius's classic 1985 there, and then they made it in the 2000s, and that's stuff. Um, but we're running low on time. A fascinating thing here to see is Girl Genius. Girl Genius is a long-running comic that started print black and white and is still running today as all digital. And so it's a fascinating comic to read, not just for the story, but also because you can see it go from the original black and white with color added as an afterthought. So you can see on the left there, they originally intended this to be in black and white, and the black and white line work is pretty good, but they put colors on top of it because I mean, color, right? And then they did something that I'm having difficulty finding examples from. In the 90s and 2000s, sometimes they would scan the pencils. They would skip the inking process altogether because, like I said with comics, well, you don't need an inking process. You can just scan the pencils and just do digital corrections on top of it. It's all digital. And so they were trying to do that. So you can still see some of the pencil scratches in the 2005 shift. There, so it's one of the rare comics that does that. And then by 2025, all digital shop. Everyone's doing everything on Wacom's now. It's all digital. And so you can see like how the style changes. So I'll leave that as an exercise for the reader. Okay, so you can see today they're still doing comics. I was going to mention quickly that the comic style, you can see the colors have changed from a lot of the rich reds, greens, and blues. Now pink and teal are extremely popular. Here's a recent Guardians of the Galaxy where they're on the blue planet. And pink is a very eye-catching color. Possibly it's not as scary as red. I don't know. I just think it's fascinating that those colors in the 90s, they did them because they couldn't do them before. And so now they did them. And now here they're doing the pink and blues that they could already do, probably because the reds are already played out. And of course, brief shout out to newspaper comics. These days, when you read a newspaper comic, they're in color because you're not reading them in a newspaper. I don't know why I call them newspaper comics. You're probably reading them in Go Comics or whatever. Even Dav Pilkey, the guy behind Captain Underpants. Captain Underpants was black and white, but Dog Cop is in color. And you can see here that many of them have moved to color, usually super flat. Big shout out to Raina Telgemeier, who has done a lot of really good super flat kind of comics, keeping the dream alive. While they have access to digital and stuff, they're also still doing a lot of the pink, teal, and yellow primaries. So let's go ahead and end on some quick tips. I know we're running a little bit over, but we'll have some questions. So just some quick tips. The influencers told me I need to talk about it like this. Okay, number one, set your palette in advance. As I mentioned earlier, when we talked about gamut, some of your colors will be illegal. So my recommendation is when you make a palette, go ahead and make like mix a bunch of colors and then make sure they're safe for whatever you're going to print on. Like run the numbers through to make sure the inks work or print safe. That's a big lesson in and of itself, but you can do that. And if you hire a third-party colorist, you can give them these colors. Even if they don't know how to make something print safe, by giving them color safe colors and say, here, use these colors, and tell them you can mix them. It's fine to mix them, but if you do mix them, try to mix them lighter before darker, because darker is where most of your problems are. That can solve a lot of your problems if you're going to print and you have to hire an assistant or do it yourself. Okay, as I also mentioned, when you're going to print, there'll be colors you just can't do. Usually you'll be tempted to tweak the sliders to make your color perfect. And I say, instead of doing that, try to think, what could I put next to this color to make it pop out? You've probably seen that thing on the left before where A and B are the exact same shade of gray. So instead of trying to make something darker or lighter where it might not show up in print or that contrast might not show up, think, what colors could I put next to this that will make it pop out? Also, shout out that even though I love color, remember neutrals are also a color. Don't forget black, white, and gray are also colors. Look at our white unicorn up there and how they pop out, or a solid black on a shape, or a gray scene. Don't forget you can use those. A lot of people are leaning all on the pink and blue, and it's like, don't forget, you can do some of those. I'm also mentioned using color as vocabulary by making one color for a reserved use for a character, or varying the palette between scene changes. You can make transitions. You can use color to help you convey change of place or where the eye is supposed to go. Another quick tip here is, this is what the digital colorists figured out very, very quickly. Don't trust the computer to make gradient transitions for you. Make sure in the midpoint or maybe some other points that those colors are also color safe. Often when the computer interpolates your colors, the computer just does straight math. Like if you wanted to go from yellow to blue, obviously you want to go through green. But then when it converts it to CMYK later, it says, well, this is half yellow and half blue. Obviously, this should be half cyan and half yellow, but that's actually a very dull, kind of washed out green. Whereas here on the right, I manually set my ramp to start off with yellow 50 and end with cyan 50, and to specifically go through a brighter green transition. This will solve like 80% of your problems right there. Like I had colorists asking me, why do my forests look so washed out or like nauseous? And it's like, nope, because you got to manually do this. And as I mentioned before, you may discover your webcomic gets a lot more mileage if you put a blue or pink filter on it. No, I don't get it either. Like someone mentioned in the chat, black and white literacy is kind of down. I mean, this might be changing. I'm hearing manga is coming back in a big way, but a discussion of tones is a bigger deal. But hey, in a pinch, blue filter. And like I said, have fun with it. You've got access to a lot of digital tools. You could be doing photo compositing. You could be doing weird textures. The comic on the left right there is somebody photographed a diorama and drew characters on top of it. Go crazy. I love to see the comics you're gonna make. And thanks very much. That was trying to appreciate color in an hour. So hopefully we dealt with some stuff. I don't know if we have any hands up. We got like 5 minutes to answer any questions. Do we have any questions?
We don't yet, but I'm sure we'll have some in just a second. And thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. That was really great to
Whew.
learn about everything. I can't believe how much you
Yeah.
packed into there.
Yeah. Oh, I edited some stuff out. So sorry. Once I had a lot more stuff I wanted to include, but I'm trying to. I know I included some terrible comics, but they were in there as examples of a lot of times. Like I said, the avatar of comics, where this is like they wanted to show off they had the technology, so here it is.
We have a comment from Rich saying, I mean, the newly famous green Yuri is making neons very popular in some
Oh, right.
circles.
Yep. Hi, Firecat. Yeah, you mentioned. Yeah, the pink is out. Green is the new pink.
Hell yeah. I want to welcome folks to share your questions in the chat. And if you would like to raise your hand, we'll welcome you to come up on mic as well. We have a question from Hikari saying, what was the workaround to what to do if Clip Studio Paint and Krita and other programs mathematically work in RGB?
Okay, so one thing to look for is something called an ICC file, and I put that in the chat. I thought I had a slide for that, but I forgot. And that was you can assign a color profile that the program's supposed to use to interpolate the data, and you can find them that match printers like newsprint, and that will help some of it. The other thing is, like I said here, these are palettes from Clip Studio, where I went and manually set the CMYK. Now they're stored as RGB in Clip Studio because Clip Studio only does math and RGB. But this helps with some of it because I already verified these colors are safe. And like I said, going lighter is usually safer than going darker. So because I went through and made these safe in the first place. And the other one I said was setting the ramps directly yourself can help a lot. These will still get somewhat reinterpreted. Like you could manually go through and tell Clip Studio when I do my gradient, you can make a gradient and pick midpoints. So you can say, okay, at the midpoint, do this as 25 cyan and 0 magenta. You can tell it that. And it's supposed to do that. It might still interpret it to be a bit off, but it'll be close enough. Like I said, this will, perfect is the enemy of good, and you want it Wednesday. So that's what I would suggest. Manually setting the colors yourself and making sure the CMYKs are correct. But the other thing is, and also you mentioned Krita, how to fix it in Krita. Krita supports CMYK natively, so change your format to CMYK. If you can change it to CMYK, go for it. And if you can't, try setting up the colors in advance and manually checking them.
We also had a question about how to ramp colors as well.
Okay, so to ramp colors here, I went and looked up some of the popular colors, like 90s Prestige. I went and looked up a comic color and anime palette. I looked up those, and I have sorted them by hue, by converting them to HSL and sorting them by hue and then by value up and down. But whatever like looks good to you. If you're doing for print, you're probably doing CMYK, which is each of those numbers is how much ink, and the more ink you have, the darker it gets. So you can see how this looks. You can also often see color ramps if you go to some of the good palette sites, like look for color palette ramp. Sorry, I should have put in links for that. What Sorry about that. But color palette ramps, looking for those, will often tell you to go from one color to another. I also arranged this in RGB like this. So if I have to go from a yellow to a blue, I know that descending makes them go a little bit color. Usually when you load palettes, they'll often be left to right ramps, but I've got mine up to down. It's like I said, it's not an exact science, but yeah, that could be a whole other presentation. The big advice I had was if you do a gradient, like if you're going to do a gradient fill, don't just go from one color to another color. Also, they should be able to set the midpoint. Like you should be able to say at 50% be this color and make sure that color is a nice clean. Like even though that comic in the right there, that purple and blue one is from 2023, they're still doing their cyans and magentas in 25% increments like it's the 1920s.
I also had a question for you too. Do you have any recommendations for people who still work traditionally and paint their comics that way and then have to configure everything to print digitally?
First, get a scanner. I know some people are trying to photograph it, but you can, in fact, one of the things you want to look for is an A3 scanner, but they usually have those. Those are 11 by 17, or actually that's 13.1 by 17.4 inches. It's metric. Usually you can get a pretty good scanner. If you can get, sometimes they come with a color correction where they have a card that already has white and black on it, so you can scan it and see if those are off. So if you're getting your brightest brights or your blackest blacks. Um, I already mentioned that these days you're going to be sending everything to PDFX, so you can work in whatever um, print format you want and then scan it. Wow, that's a big can of worms to get in a lot of this. I will remind you once again. I will mention that there is the gamut problem, like we saw with the Parkinson picture there, where the EverQuest, where he painted the elf in the Pacific Midwest. There will be colors you can paint that can't be picked up by a scanner, and then when the scanner like has RGB and then sends that off to the printer will have to convert the RGB. So you're going to lose some detail. Anytime you transfer from one media to another gamut, unless you're doing the most high-end expensive equipment, you will lose. So I guess the short advice I had was notice contrast, contrast, contrast. If you're wondering why these old school guys made everything harsh black and harsh white, and why even in the modern era, it's often a harsh blue next to a harsh pink. They're doing those harsh contrasts because they can be sure those are going to work. So don't underestimate the power of contrast.
I will definitely be keeping that in mind for my own work for sure. I feel like I have learned so much today that I would like to adopt into my workflow process. Um, do we have any other questions that we would like to talk about today? All right. I believe you mentioned also wanting to share a PDF with folks at the end.
Oh yeah, there's the link on the screen
Yay.
right now.
Ah,
I
that's
can
right.
go ahead and type in the text here. But that is my
I
personal
gotcha.
vanity site. It has links to it has links to my other stuff, but the first link there is the PDF of today's presentation. I think it matches. I may have changed one or two slides. It's available in both PDF format and B movie format. So
Awesome.
yeah, direct link to the PDF.
Thank you
If you
so
if you want to
much.
see these slides again. And yeah, thank you. And of course, there'll be a video posted later.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to be posting this to the Co-op Library as well as Co-op YouTube. Also, hi, Narrow. And I also wanted to mention that we have a feedback survey, if y'all wouldn't mind filling that out. This will help us to kind of understand what you're looking for in future events so we can make some more for you. And that is open all year round, but feel free to get that to us within the next week or so to give us some feedback for today. Xīn Jīn, thank you so much again for this wonderful presentation. This is really fantastic. I'm so impressed by how much work you put in and how much information I've learned today too.
Oh yeah, I'm here to help. So yeah, I'll be in the we have a cartoonist co-op Discord, so I'm there to. There's people who know more than I do, but my goal is just hopefully we can get folks we can demystify this a little bit and get some of the maybe get you around the more common errors.
Yes, absolutely. Would you be okay if people ping you directly or talk to you in DMs?
Yes,
Yeah,
but before
awesome.
I'm buried in snow.
Yeah, they'll have something to keep you busy with.
There
All
we go.
right. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording for now. If I can find it, there we go.